We're going to start by really letting our experts take us in the best direction, which is really tell us what they know and what probably would be most valuable for each of us to know in leaving here. And so I'll just start with the gentleman next to me, and I'll let you get started.
Well, we've been asked to talk about community economic development and address some of the challenges. And when I started doing community economic development 25 years ago, when I was 15, an article had come out, it came out around that time by a Harvard Business School professor called Michael Porter. The article was called The Competitive Advantage of the Inner City. And why was that article marking an important moment? Up until pretty much that point, there were countless efforts by communities of color and low-income communities to attract capital to their neighborhoods. Their neighborhoods were being depleted of jobs, depleted of capital, and depleted of middle class and professional residences. The inner city was being abandoned. And Porter writes an article saying, why is the inner city being abandoned? Why the inner city is so close to economic, political, financial power in cities? What's the challenge here? What gives? And following the article, and I'm not saying because of the article, but the article did mark a moment. Over the last 20 years, I think we've seen incredible growth in the number of strategies and investments that have taken place in the inner city. The idea that we had back when, and maybe corroborated by other panelists, was a concept we called community economic development. It wasn't just economic development. It had to have the three. Community was the agent, was the instigator, but was also supposed to be the beneficiary. It was the actor and the recipient. And in order for community economic development to be community economic development, it had to have the three. It had to have the community. It had to have an economic base or foundation. It had to improve the economy. And it had to be developmental. And it sounds like perhaps over time we emphasize way too much on the economic, and we may have forgotten about the community part and about the developmental part, such that today we find ourselves victims perhaps of our own success in attracting capital and business to some parts of some inner cities, such that now the very residents who were the catalysts, the instigator, as we very much learned from Michael Wilson and his example, were the ones that were more likely then to be left behind and left out. Development is the goal, not displacement. And this is key. We started implementing what we called people-based strategies. These were all the supports we could provide to individuals to make sure the workforce development, family supports, to support and strengthen individuals' human capital and their capacity to connect to the economy. And then we had what we called place-based strategies, where we took an area, and the focus was on the kinds of policies that would make an area better and more attractive. And I think today what we're looking for is not just people-based strategies where we focus on the people and forget about the place, or on place-based strategies where we do and change the place but forget about the people. And we need to really refocus on what we call people-place-based strategies. So it's not just then about attracting new businesses to the community. It's about taking stock of existing businesses, existing entrepreneurs, existing human capital stock, and figuring out how to develop that and make it better. So it's not just about, again, attracting the big box, name your favorite pharmacy to the neighborhood, but it's about identifying the 4 or 5 pharmacists you already have, some of whom actually may be residents of the neighborhood, and asking yourself the question, what can we as a community do to ensure that that pharmacy and that pharmacist stays in business and develops the community? So we know that there are some key ingredients, and I'll close with this, to community economic development, such that without these elements, it can be economic, it can be perhaps development, but it isn't community economic development. And first, it's a long-term endeavor. Community economic development is not something you do overnight. It's a fight for the long term. It has to be well planned and involve some planning. Planning and visioning by community residents for community residents, where what they import is the resources, the tools, the technical expertise, but not the very devices that are going to exclude them from their own communities. It has to be inclusive and equitable. It has to be holistic. It's not just about a retail strip or a particular sector of the economy. It's about looking at the neighborhood comprehensively and figuring out what work are the people in the neighborhood doing, how much of it is in the neighborhood, how much of it is outside the neighborhood, and what is the economic structure of that neighborhood, and how can it be better connected to the residents of that neighborhood, so that you're not importing workers into the neighborhood, but utilizing the human capital you have available once you've identified it and trained it properly in those businesses. It has to be initiated and supported, as I've said, by community members themselves. If it's just a bunch of experts arriving in a helicopter with the resources, I would question the medium and long-term benefit to the residents of such endeavors. And we've seen those endeavors. Lastly, I mean, it has to be grounded in not just the needs and experience of community members, but in the needs and experience of the kinds of community organizations that support neighborhood residents. They need to be included. They need to have a leading voice. And yes, people may not always know how to get to where they want to go, but they certainly know what they want, where they want to go. So I've heard in the panel this morning about patronizing attitudes, and I think in the area of community economic development, just as in the area of capital access, we suffer from a lot of patronizing attitudes by many experts who claim to, again, parachute into a neighborhood and know what is best for the neighborhood. I think in community economic development, as we move forward, we need more hands and more ears, and perhaps less mouths in the process. And lastly, I mean, an insight from the panel this morning is that it appears, and this is something that we need to think through as we move forward, that it is very cheap to be rich, and it is very expensive to be poor. And part of what community economic development tries to do is to make it less expensive to be poor, and make the experience of low-income residents in low-income communities a richer experience in their own lives, not an experience that ends up excluding them from the benefit that occurs and accrues to their own communities.